responsive. We're off to a good start. My name is Mary Ortiz, and I'm the head of school here at Oakrest. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the second annual O'Donovan Humanities Lecture. Before introducing our speaker, I want to give you some background on the inspiration behind the evening. We seek two ends with this annual lecture. The first is to honor great teachers, and the second is to uphold the importance of the humanities. Pope Emeritus Benedict gave a jewel of an address to young professors from universities in Spain during World Youth Day in Madrid 2011. He said, "Young people need authentic teachers, persons open to the fullness of truth in various branches of knowledge, persons who listen to and experience in their own hearts the interdisciplinary dialogue, persons who above all are convinced of our human capacity to advance along the path of truth. The lofty aspiration to seek truth is the most precious gift you could give to your students, personally and by example." He went on, "Never lose that enthusiasm and concern for truth. Always remember that teaching is not just about communicating content, but about forming young people. You need to understand and love them, to awaken their innate thirst for truth and their yearning for transcendence. Be for them a source of encouragement and strength." This portrait of the teacher speaks directly to the importance of the humanities in education, because this kind of teacher pursues the goal of a liberal education, which is to form a person to embrace the full measure of what it means to be human. That's also taken from the address. Pat O'Donovan is the inspiration behind the evening because she spent many years bringing these lofty aspirations to life. She was the first headmistress at Oakrest from the day the school opened with 22 students in 1976 to 1979 when it had moved to its Yuma Street location. She refers to those 2 brief years as the time when she was the acting head, holding the fort until Diane Hunter, the next head of school, could come to Washington. Pat said this because she was always first and foremost a teacher and not an administrator. But there's a nice double meaning in that acting head title, because anyone who knows Pat knows that she's a consummate actress, which is part of what makes her classes so absolutely engaging. Pat is gifted with the ability to convey to students what Louise Cowan, one of the founders of the University of Dallas and a great educator herself, has called the sheer expansive joy of learning. Pat is a consummate professional, maintains very high standards for herself and her students. Miss O'Donovan, or Miss O.D., did not ever put up with nonsense. She has a wonderful sense of humor, an infectious laugh, and a perennial youthful willingness to be surprised by beauty, truth, and knowledge. With Pat, there's always something new to learn, to share with others, to be delighted and instructed by. Pat was always interested in language arts, English, and foreign languages. Every English class includes a lot of history, and every history course addresses English language expression through a rigorous writing component. For 24 years, she taught either English, history, or both at Oakrest and Montrose. Montrose is a school in Boston with a similar mission to Oakrest. And Pat was part of the founding team at both schools. She retired in 2002 from Montrose, and for some years has regularly designed and taught summer courses in history, English, and current events. Pat joined us from Boston, where she lives, for the first O'Donovan lecture in 2014. I told her when I picked her up at the airport for that occasion that a few people, a little bit shyly, had asked if the lecture was a memorial lecture. She got a great kick out of that, peals of laughter. And if you know her, you know how very funny that is. She's what, I love this line from Chesterton's, she's what American millionaires and gangsters call a live wire. But unfortunately, I'm speaking of her in the present and the past tense. She's still alive. The past tense is because she was a teacher, but tonight she has a travel plan that conflicts with tonight. So she sends her very best to everyone, and especially to our speaker. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Meghan Gurdon, our 2015 O'Donovan Humanities Lecturer. Meghan is an essayist, book critic, and former foreign correspondent. Since 2005, she's been a children's book reviewer for the Wall Street Journal. Her journal column covers the full range of books for the young and runs every weekend in the review section. She's also written many other critical pieces for the paper. She had a twice-weekly column on domestic sketches for the Washington Examiner, and another weekly column on family life called The Fever Swamp for the National Review Online. Her work has appeared in numerous other publications, including the Daily Telegraph, the Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, and many others. In the 1990s, Meghan lived and worked overseas, filing radio stories and newspaper dispatches. Based first in Hong Kong and later in Tokyo and London, she traveled and reported from such places as Cambodia, Somalia, China, Israel, South Korea, and Northern Ireland. Meghan graduated magna cum laude from Bowdoin College in 1986. She became a Catholic in 1999, just in time for the Jubilee year of 2000. Timing is everything. She and her husband, Hugo Gurdon, who we're delighted to have here tonight, a fellow journalist, have 5 beautiful children, 2 of whom are in college and 2 of whom are here tonight. On a personal note, I have the joy of calling Meghan a faithful old friend. I have to work on that. We met as freshmen at Bowdoin when I decided to direct a one-act play. Meghan auditioned. I immediately spotted a rising talent and cast her as the lead actress in Mark Twain's The Diary of Adam and Eve. We had such a great time and such overwhelming success with the play that she played the lead again in my next and last ever one-act, Aria da Campo by Edna St. Vincent Millay. What a poetic name. People are still talking about these plays. I don't know what they're saying. It was a great mark for theater at Bowdoin. But when you begin a friendship, I'm telling you this because when you begin a friendship in this illustrious way, it's guaranteed that it will survive the test of time. It has, and it will. And it adds a very strong note of delight to the honor of welcoming you this evening, Meghan.
Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who lacked for nothing but a child to love. Theirs was a country with a noble history, and they yearned for sons and daughters to whom they could bequeath the rich culture that they and their people so enjoyed. So it was with jubilation that the kingdom received news that the queen had been safely delivered of a baby girl at last. The next night, in a chapel at the castle, the king and queen watched with solemn joy as their daughter was christened. Then they repaired to a small gilded chamber for a celebratory supper with the 5 fairies they had asked to be godmothers to their child. Good books for children almost always include descriptions of the food. C.S. Lewis wrote them in, so did Laura Ingalls Wilder, so does J.K. Rowling on purpose because of what C.S. Lewis did. So I had better tell you what they ate. The royal couple and the fairies sat down to a feast of succulent roast pork with ruby red currant jelly wobbling in a silver bowl, and fresh asparagus with sea salt and olive oil, crisp from the oven and slightly caramelized at the tips, and a refreshing salad of rare and delicate Rapunzel lettuce. They had delicious wines and sparkling waters, and afterwards everyone could have as much as anyone wanted from boxes of chocolates swathed in violet ribbons. And when all had had their fill, the senior fairy put down her jeweled goblet and said, "Sisters, let us now give our gifts to the princess." So the fairies arose, and they approached the cradle. Using her wand, the eldest fairy pointed gently toward the sleeping child. "I," said the fairy, "give her elegance, with posture as regal as her parentage." Said the second fairy, "I give her intelligence, such that she will flourish in all girls' education and always get straight A's." "Oh no," interrupted the third fairy. "She needs a B once in a while." This fairy thought that children should have some humility. "Fair enough," said the second fairy. The fourth fairy nodded. "I give her language, a lively vocabulary, a command of sentence structure, a feeling for cadence, and a warm sympathy for good writing." This was the best gift yet, and the king and queen beamed. And finally, it was the turn of fairy number 5 to give her gift. She said, give her a long attention span so that she can gaze upon the beauty of the world and contemplate it, so that she will listen closely when others are speaking, and so that someday, when she is grown, she will be able to read the novels of Henry James. Well, everyone was feeling very happy about the princess and all the nice gifts, when suddenly the door of the chamber burst open. There came a terrible thunderclap, and a cloud of stinking smoke filled the room. In the foul miasma, the party was horrified to see fairy number 6, an uninvited guest reeking malevolence. She wore a t-shirt with the Nietzsche quotation, "The God is dead." And she held in her hand not a wand, but some sort of sleek, inviting device with an apple on it. "Fools," she said. "Did you think you could keep me out? I have gifts of my own for the baby. I bring technology and distraction and empty glamour. Not just to the child, but to her parents too. And not just to her parents, but to the entire kingdom. I give them texting and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat. I give them Twitter and Words with Friends and Candy Crush. My gifts will squander their time, scatter their thoughts, ruin their posture, seduce them away from one another by means of countless shallow diversions, and ultimately make it impossible for them to enjoy long-form writing." And with a triumphant cry and another repulsive puff of smoke, fairy number 6 disappeared. You can imagine the horror on the faces of the king and the queen and the fairies, on the faces of all but one, that is. The third fairy, the one who thought that the princess shouldn't get straight A's all the time, had never had a chance to bestow her present, and now she spoke. "I cannot take back the gifts my vengeful sister has given," she said, "but I can bequeath something that will mitigate their ill effects." I wonder if anyone can guess what that thing is. "I give this child the gift of reading aloud. From this night forward, her parents will spend at least an hour every evening reading to this child for a long time. Reading to her. For a long time, she will sit on their laps, and they will show her board books with simple words and illustrations, and she may not seem to react. After all, she was only born yesterday. But the king and queen will persist, and soon the princess will follow pictures and stories with increasing interest. And as she grows, the stories too will grow, becoming longer and more complex, and the nightly practice will become precious to this family, and it will help form the mind and heart of this child. And it will also enliven the minds and kindle the hearts of her mother and father, especially if they try to read her children's tales by Oscar Wilde, such as the story of the selfish giant, which is impossible for any adult to read aloud without crying. And yea, the fairy went on, though technology will batter at this family, and the princess will get a smartphone, same as her friends when she's old enough to take public transportation, by herself, and there will be Snapchat and Instagram, for that is how it is with teenage girls. Never will she lose the imprint of those many calm, happy hours of listening to the voices of her parents read aloud. The king and queen smiled through their tears. Could it be? Was there really a remedy for the awful curse of the 6th fairy? And could it be one so simple? Ladies and gentlemen, it could, and it is, and that is what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. First of all, I want to just say quickly, thank you, Mary, for this honor. It's really delightful to be here for this event, and I'm really thrilled and flattered that you would choose me. And as I said to Mary as I came in, it's an incredibly risky move to invite an old college friend to address me. We knew each other before we were grown-ups. Anyway, I'm here to tell you tonight that reading aloud can be one of the central civilizing practices of family life, an incredible source of joy and fun and unit cohesion. In an age of technology, the family that reads aloud together commits a cheerful act of rebellion, refusing to atomize and disperse, each to his own screen and to his own virtual reality. In an age of fragmentation and social change, the family that reads aloud together fortifies itself. The family that reads together puts the riches of literature at the center of the home by the coziest means possible. It enriches the grammar and vocabulary and imaginations of its members. It furnishes the minds of its children with wonderful tidbits they might never get elsewhere. It offers teaching moments without number, and it builds a shared in-house language of characters and scenes and witticisms. I will give you an example from my own household. There was a day not so long ago when I overheard one of our daughters jokingly denounce another as a common, low-fat barge woman. She was quoting Mr. Toad from The Wind in the Willows. I could not have been prouder. Spending an hour every night with a pile of beautiful picture books, or on a couple of chapters of My Father's Dragon, or Winnie the Pooh, or Stuart Little, or Treasure Island, fosters all kinds of good things. Empathy and creativity, the ability to listen closely, an instinct for good grammar, a deep attachment to the family, and a zest for books and for the world. Now, these are extravagant claims, I know, and they're all true. So tonight I'm going to talk a bit about the habit of reading aloud and what it does for children and grown-ups who love them most, and then we'll get into some of the larger cultural ramifications. Okay, first off, I think it's fair to say that everyone knows that reading aloud to small children is a good idea. I don't think there's any controversy about that. We also all know that we need to get sufficient quantities of vitamin D. But does that stop us from developing deficiencies? No, it does not. So too with reading out loud. It is a practice so nourishing and important that it is worth now and then stopping to ask, what does vitamin D do again? No, not kidding. What does reading aloud do again? And is my family getting enough? Last year, for the first time, the American Academy of Pediatrics began putting its weight behind the wonderfulness of reading aloud, starting in infancy, like the princess in our story. Some 62,000, I think it is, pediatricians now will begin, or have begun, recommending that kids get a daily allowance of read-alouds along with the other nutrients that their bodies need. Scientific research increasingly confirms what everyone in this room probably knows instinctively, that reading with babies and toddlers, and older children too, is incredibly good for their little brains. Lots of cuddly time spent poring over board books, hearing them read out loud, connecting the words to the pictures, maybe seeking and finding objects in the pictures at a parent's prompting. All this fills their tiny heads with what Australian writer and literacy advocate Mem Fox calls rhythmic gems. I just want to pause for a second. Does this sound okay to everyone? Yeah. Sibilants are a little sharp for me. Is that okay? Is that better? Feel better? Okay. So, Mem Fox, the Australian, she's wonderful, very, very bouncy writer, and she says that reading aloud, I love to quote her here because she's so good, it gives young children, I can't quite do her accent, but a huge store of information to bring to the task of learning to read. A nice fat bank of language, words, phrases, structures and grammar. Words in their heads then begin to drift into their daily speech, and all at once we have an articulate child. The tenderness of the time together is also not to be underestimated. For an article I wrote earlier this summer on this topic, I chatted with the writer Kate DiCamillo, who Because of Winn-Dixie, and on many, many books, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. She had a beautiful way of describing it. She said, we let down our guard when someone we love is reading us a story. We exist together in a little patch of warmth and light. It's true, we do. I mean, I have spent most nights for the last 21 years reading to my own children. First there was one, a daughter, and I read to her. And then came a son, and I brought him along while I was reading to his sister. Pretty soon there came another daughter, and another. And that meant that every night we would read a variety of books. Maybe each child would choose a picture book, and then there'd be a bigger book at the end that they would not have been able to read themselves, that I would read to them. And people would be draped all over the place, you know, like I remember the image of my son as being like a panther over my shoulders, while everyone else tucked in. And so, you know, we might have Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel as one child's request, and then Sylvester and the Magic Pebble as somebody else's, and maybe Make Way for Ducklings, and Goodnight Moon, of course, for the youngest child always, and then a chapter or two of Little House on the Prairie, or Little House in the Big Woods, or one of the Little House books. And after a bit there came a fourth and final daughter, there she is, and we added her to the mix. So we'd go through cycles, read all the Little House books, plus a lot of picture books always, and then maybe through a mess of novels, and then all the way through the Chronicles of Narnia, and then we'd read The Hobbit, and Peter Pan, and The Island of the Blue Dolphins, and The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, and Beowulf, and the D'Aulaire's Greek Myths, and I don't know what all, lots of books. So our youngest, who's here tonight, is 10, and we're now deep into C.S. Lewis, The Silver Chair, again. And it struck me the other day that this might be the last time I'm reading my way through Narnia out loud, at least for a while. My first reaction was, "Ooh, sad." And my second was, "Thank goodness." I love these books, don't get me wrong, but I do think I've read all of them aloud pretty much every other year for 2 decades. Also, it's kind of annoying because we have a problem with the Narnia series at our house. Nobody now ever wants to hear the last battle. It's too sad. They don't want to hear it. And I say, do I not? It's about getting to heaven. They can't stand those awful scenes of Puzzle the donkey being fitted with a lion's skin like a false prophet, or the scene when the dwarves shoot all the horses. Oh, too much. Anyway, back to our larger point. Chesterton said, "We need to so view the world as to combine an idea of wonder and an idea of welcome." That is just what reading aloud does for children as they move out of toddlerhood and into proper childhood. Wonder and welcome and a stake in their literary patrimony. It's what we give them when we open a book of Aesop's fables and unfurl the story of the fox and the grapes. Moral, it is easy to despise what you do not have. It's what we give them when we take them down the Yangtze River with little Ping the duckling. It's what we give them when we take them down the rabbit hole with Alice, or to Africa or India by way of the Just So stories, oh best beloved, in Kipling's strange and memorable telling with its odd, inky little illustrations. In The Magician's Nephew, another chronicle of Narnia, coming to a bedroom soon near me, there is a magical wood. Perhaps you know this wood. It's very quiet, very still. In between the trees, there are countless pools of water. The pools don't move very deep, but each of them, if you jump in, will lead you down to an entirely different reality. A distinct world with its own inhabitants and history and even constellations. In the story, the magical wood is called the wood between the worlds. To me, there's almost no better metaphor than for that. That is to say, this wood is there's no better metaphor than this wood for that moment in a child's bedroom after everyone's had their baths and you have yet to choose the book or books for that night. Picture books may not look particularly deep. Most of them are no longer than 32 pages, yet each has its own reality, its own inhabitants, and its own means of engaging a child's imagination. Chapter books may be slim paperbacks, and they may have a lot of goofy fun. Pippi Longstocking comes to mind. Yet they too are a world unto themselves. More complex stories are like older worlds, with longer histories that resonate in deeper ways, and with big red suns hanging in their ancient skies. Jumping into each of these pools is a new experience. Sometimes you find the water is too shallow and your feet hit the ground really fast and nobody cares very much, and whatever that book was, you don't read it again. But sometimes the reader and the listeners want to submerge themselves over and over. They feel enriched and enlightened and altered by the exposure to a story. Excuse me. Like Marco Rubio. Literature itself is full of stories of personal transformations as a direct consequence of hearing stories read aloud. One of my favorites is Tom Canty, the impoverished hero of Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper. If anyone's read that. Anyway, Tom lives in circumstances of utter squalor and ignorance and foolishness and riot and drunkenness in 16th century London. But he has the good fortune to come under the clandestine tutelage of an old priest who's been chucked out by the king. And when Tom is not begging for pennies, he listens, Twain writes, I'm going to quote here, to good Father Andrew's charming old tales and legends about giants and fairies, dwarves and genii, and enchanted castles and gorgeous kings and princes. His head grew full of these wonderful things, and many a night as he lay in the dark on his scant and offensive straw, tired, hungry, and smarting from a thrashing, he unleashed his imagination and soon forgot his aches and pains in delicious picturings to himself of the charmed life of a petted prince in a regal palace. Twain goes on to explain that Tom begins to read the old priest's books, the priest teaches him to read, I should say, and to ask the men to explain and enlarge upon what he finds in them. By and by, Twain goes on, Tom's reading and dreaming about princely life wrought such a strong effect upon him that he began to act the prince, unconsciously. His speech and manners became curiously ceremonious and courtly, to the vast admiration and amusement of his intimates. But Tom's influence among these young people began to grow day by day, and in time he came to be looked up to by them with a sort of wondering awe as a superior being. He seemed to know so much, and he could do and say such marvelous things, and withal, he was so deep and wise. Could there be a better ad for reading aloud? Pretty soon, as you may remember, Tom is actually mistaken for a real prince and finds himself inside the court of Henry VIII, being treated as his pampered scion. So, for us, maybe that's not so realistic, but Tom's fictional story points to the observable real-life gains that children, rich or poor, make when adults take the time to read to them. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the 1995 study that found the famous word gap. Basically, by the age of 3, children in wealthier or more educated American households have heard literally millions more words spoken aloud than children in less motivated or functional or poorer households. Evidence of the word gap apparently manifests as early as 18 months. And it seems to have a strong bearing on later academic achievement. So, in a way, it's amazing that the American Academy of Pediatrics took so long to put it on the to-do list for new parents, but I'm glad it's happening. This past summer, there's a British philosopher named Adam Swift, and this is a controversy that some of you may have heard. He got all sorts of really scathing emails after he had given an interview to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. He was plugging a new book, and in the interview he said, and I will quote, "The evidence shows that the difference between those who get bedtime stories and those who don't, the difference in their life chances, is bigger than the difference between those who get elite private schooling and those that don't." It's a stunning claim. As it happens, Professor Swift was using the phrase bedtime stories as a kind of shorthand for the overall culture of the family, parenting styles, dinner conversations, informal back and forth, but also reading at bedtime. What made people crazy is that he went on to joke that perhaps those of us who do read to our children at night ought occasionally to consider that we are, as he put it, unfairly disadvantaging other people's children. It certainly was puckish. Maybe not the most persuasive way to connect the dots between the way children are raised and their life outcomes. His interest in the subject, I believe, came from a wish to analyze how best the state could intervene to equalize the prospect of good outcomes for children. And in his book he writes, "The inequalities between children stem from processes more central to, one might say constitutive of, family life than egalitarians would have hoped." Indeed. It's not money that makes it possible to read to a child. You don't need money. All you need is a book, and you can get those for free from the public library. And actually, if other households are like our household, you don't even need that many books. We have a house full of books, but the truth is, we like to go back to the same ones over and over again. But what is required is a bit of determination and a bit of time. The writer and illustrator Rosemary Wells, another champion of reading aloud, has long argued for just 20 minutes a day. I think their campaign is called Read to Your Bunny. 20 minutes, half an hour a day of reading. I personally think more is better if you can do it, but sometimes 20 minutes is all you can manage. But anyway, Rosemary Wells is very eloquent about what results from this. She says, "The child who sits in a reader's lap is more privileged than the child who is given fancy computer games. This child can be poor. He can live in the meanest streets of a huge city or in a house trailer in the far reaches of the rural hills. If his father sits and reads quietly to him for half an hour a day, this boy is not at risk. He is blessed and will grow up smart and strong." Children whose parents read to them aloud are children whose minds and hearts are receiving a special kind of nightly maintenance. These children make understanding friends, decent writers, and fun traveling companions. Having met all manner of curious personalities in books, they're more likely to tolerate and enjoy eccentricity in the real world, and hopefully in their parents as well. Their minds will be more handsomely furnished than others with literary and cultural references, and perhaps the rhythms of poetry. Our children, like us, are primates, monkey see, monkey do. When we send humane, thoughtful, well-read children out into the world, they encourage those traits in their friends. So reading aloud as a family is not just a private act, it has public effects. And it strengthens the larger culture in other ways. Reading classic literature in particular perpetuates the consciousness of characters, customs, and virtues that come from the past, belong in the present, and deserve to travel into the future. To read a book aloud is to bring a story to life, and it is a kind of life, especially if you use voices for each character and really occupy the story as you're reading it. Stories remain alive, we might say, in the mouths of those who read them and in the minds of those who hear them. When stories are no longer told, they fall from the frame of reference of the world and they die. So in reading aloud every evening, families are, in a serious way, keeping faith with the past, putting new roots into it, while sending fresh blossoms, as it were, into the future. That may sound a little obscure or fair, but there are good reasons, I think, for all of us to be worried about the degree to which children are becoming disconnected from the past, culturally and in other ways, deracinated, untethered, and lost. Technology is stealing huge chunks of childhood. 5 years ago, the Kaiser Family Foundation found that children between the ages of 8 and 18 spent an average of just over 7.5 hours using entertainment media every day. And because so much of that time involved multitasking, the real time that children spent online was, or with devices one way or another, was about 10 hours and 45 minutes. Kaiser is not planning another study, alas, I checked. But does anyone here think that children and teenagers are spending less time on technology now than they were 5 years ago? I suppose it's possible that the young people are using their time online to read thrilling works of literary fiction. I don't know, it seems unlikely. According to this year's annual Scholastic study of reading patterns, Scholastic is a children's publisher, 52% of children do have grown-up reading to them when they're little. It drops to 34% by the time children are between 6 and 8. And by the time children are between 9 and 11 years old, only 17% of them have someone reading to them a story most nights of the week. Now, as Mark Twain would remind us, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. So as melancholy as those figures sound, the real picture may be more sanguine. But here's something really sad. From the same study, 40% of 6 to 11-year-olds whose parents no longer read aloud to them wished it were still happening. Whoa! And not only are most children not being read to, so they're not being enriched by books that might stretch them beyond what they can read for themselves, they might also not be getting great books at school. They might not. Depends on where they live and how right on their teachers are. When I was in 7th grade and had just been enrolled in a 4-room elementary school in rural Maine, I heard the principal of my school reflect on the kinds of music that he liked and the kinds of music that he didn't like. And one particular remark stuck in my memory. He said, "I don't like that Mozart crap." If you have a teacher like that, there are lots of lovely writers you will probably never encounter. And swashbuckling adventures you will never hear, and arias you will certainly never hear. I mean, at a school like Oakcrest or at the Heights, the opposite happens every day. I know this. Your kids read great books. Your teachers, I'm sure, as we have from this lecture tonight, they're wholly alive to the excellence of conveying the best of the past into the future by means of the present. It is probably safe to assume that here, and at similarly retrograde schools, children will make the acquaintance of Milton and Homer and Shakespeare and of Dickens and Austen and Byron. We know this is not the case everywhere. Indeed, you can now get an English degree from Georgetown University, or from Johns Hopkins, or Amherst, or Williams, or UVA, among others, without having to take a single class on Shakespeare. That the study of English could be conducted without regard to its single most gifted exponent seems to be something from The Onion, or from another satirical magazine. I mean, it's incredible. There you are. That is cultural drift. There are sharper, more violent ways to separate people from the wellsprings of their own societies. And I'd like you to bear with me here. We are taking a detour, but it leads back, I promise. Until I was standing right here, right now, I didn't realize what a sharp detour this is going to seem like, so bear with me. The mass murdering dictators of the last century all launched extensive and bloody campaigns to purge the past, to rip people away from it, from the art and the music and the poetry, from old cultural traditions and religious consolations and ways of dress and even practices of cooking and eating. Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong in China, but also North Korea's Kim Il-sung and Pol Pot in Cambodia. They all wanted adults to submit and behave, and they wanted deracinated children to become the malleable material of the indoctrinating revolutionary state. To this day, in North Korea, children grow up knowing only stories that sell a propagandistic party line, miraculous tales of the wondrous and entirely phony doings of the tyrannical Kim clan that run the place. We have obviously been more fortunate in this country. No tyrant is using violence to try and separate us from our cultural heritage. But there are other actors and other methods. Now is probably not the moment to go too deeply into the social phenomena of which everyone in this room will be aware. Enough to say that the armies of political correctness continue to march. The discrediting of the thoughts and writing of dead white European males proceeds apace. Live ones, too, of course. The other day on NPR, I read the novelist Jonathan Franzen dismissed because having pale skin, he's writing from a place of white privilege. Incredible. And heaven help those of us who don't get with the social program at the right moment to please the baying mob on Twitter. The postmodern tripartite obsession with race, class, and gender continues to produce an apparently inexhaustible supply of grievances about the ways our culture departs from perfection. Causes of grievance, often so small, they are called microaggressions. Microaggressions are so upsetting that they can trigger bad feelings. And bad feelings are not to be borne. We must prevent the delivery of bad feelings by stopping microaggressions before they begin, and the only way to do that is to attack the roots of the problem, which is race, class, and gender. Again, no one is using violence, but we're seeing the same awful impulse to dig out and expunge and extirpate old ways. They might offend or pollute afresh. The New York Gilbert and Sullivan players have just canceled their production of The Mikado that was scheduled to run in December. The show is set in feudal Japan and mostly makes fun of Englishmen, and the music is wonderfully witty. But apparently The Mikado trades too much in offensive racial stereotypes. Plus, the company's actors are not Japanese, so to look Japanese on stage, they would have to wear makeup, and that's called yellowface, and that is offensive. Next season, meanwhile, the Metropolitan Opera is mounting a production of Verdi's Othello, but the lead tenor will not wear dark makeup so as to look North African. The character is North African. He's a Moor in an Italian opera set in Cyprus, but on the stage in New York, Othello will have white skin for fear of evoking blackface or minstrelry, which are offensive. Now, you may be thinking, in fact, I would wager that you are thinking, we have strayed an awfully long way from cozy scenes of families tucked up, reading at night. But what is happening in the wider world has a direct bearing on what happens at home, and vice versa. The truth is, almost every year, whole new realms are becoming offensive and controversial. Marriage does not mean what everyone used to think marriage meant. Men may or may not be men. Women may or may not have been men. In children's books, as in the wider culture, depictions of former ways of being in the world are open to question and possibly dangerous. Should children still be reading heteronormative baby books, such as Pat and Bunny? After all, it depicts a conventional white family with a daddy who shaves and a mummy who invites the reader to poke a finger through her ring, and it's probably a wedding ring. What about Little House on the Prairie? How Ma has a poor opinion of Indians and says so. Or how in one scene, Pa and the other men at their South Dakota town appear in, yes, blackface and sing and dance in a minstrel show. The townspeople in the book are seen to enjoy the spectacle. Should children even know that such events and attitudes existed in the 19th century? Will they be allowed to know as the years go by and the books are reissued? Or will such scenes that offend modern sensibilities be made to disappear down the memory hole? Ray Bradbury used his 1953 novel, Fahrenheit 451, to warn of the danger posed to literature by the armies of the offended. And in an incredible twist, some of you may know this story, considering that his book is all about the destruction of troublesome books and censorship, Bradbury's publisher actually censored sections of his book in later editions behind his back. As the 60s and 70s progressed, meanwhile, Bradbury was getting complaints about defects in his novel, such as its male chauvinism, which was a very big issue at the time, I recall. In an acid afterword to the 1979 reissue, Bradbury let fly. He wrote, "It is a mad world and it will get madder if we allow the minorities, be they dwarf or giant, orangutan or dolphin, nuclear head or water conversationalist, pro-computerologist or neo-Luddite, simpleton or sage, to interfere with aesthetics." He went on, "There is more than one way to burn a book, and the world is full of people running around with matches." The present is sometimes in great haste to expunge the past, and it is a species of tragedy. Those benighted people in the past made the present possible, after all. A tiny measure of gratitude would seem to be in order. The nightly reading, in this context, is an act of generational fealty. In a very real way, it becomes a means of cultural conservation, of preservation, and of resistance. Scheherazade and Robin Hood and Hercules remain alive as long as we tell their stories. For children, the really great thing about hearing stories read aloud at home is that, no offense, it's not school. There's no cod liver oil, and no essay to write. For us grown-ups, reading aloud can be a kind of reclamation, a regrounding. We're enjoying the stories too, and if we're inclined to use goofy voices, well, that just adds to the pleasure. But when you're a child, a little kid listening to your parents tell you stories, which is what it's like listening to someone read aloud, you're not thinking, "Ah, yes, I am the recipient of a radical act of cultural transference." You're thinking about the story. You're in the story. What's happening? What's going to happen next? Which reminds me, we never did finish our story, did we? Now let me see. Where were we? Ah, yes. Clever third fairy had just given her gift to the infant princess. Here we are. Was there really a remedy for the awful curse of the sixth fairy? And could it be one so simple? At this point, one of my children would have said, "Mommy, we already read this part." It could. And so it came to pass, as the third fairy foretold. The princess grew up smart and strong and got all A's with a couple of B's. Some years later, she married the prince of a neighboring kingdom, and as their children came into the world, great was the pleasure she took in carrying on the tradition of reading to them. The king and queen were exemplary grandparents, and they too read to the tots whenever they could. It is true that reading did not happen every single night exactly. Sometimes a pageant or a council meeting would go late, and it was 11 before the children were in bed, and plus it was a school night. And there were nights when the parents had been making merry over lunch and kept the whole ordeal to a couple of picture books. And I'm sorry to say that once or twice a noble voice was heard to say, "The movie was your story tonight." But on the whole, fine things happened in the imperial households as a result of the third fairy's gift. Following the example of their sovereigns, that is, the mothers and fathers of both kingdoms adopted the practice of reading aloud in their own homes. The common people logged off email, put their phones on vibrate, and snuggled up by the fire after supper to read Bread and Jam for Francis, and Curious George, and The Secret Garden, and The Wizard of Oz, and dozens of other wonderful stories to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And do you know what? They all lived happily ever after.